Well, good morning, folks. It's early afternoon on a rainy Tuesday here in Dallas. If you're in the area and you're walking around on Lake Street, you'll probably see that my house is the one that's surrounded by 6 or 8 inches of grass because I haven't been able to cut it. Although maybe other people are in the same situation. So I want to say something about the topic of last week's module as I'm working my way through your discussion boards, and I find myself typing the same thing over and over again. I want to say a little bit about physician-assisted suicide, medical assistance in dying, and suffering, and also the idea of control. Okay, so I do find this a difficult issue in a lot of different ways, because one of the reasons I think I find it difficult is that we sometimes encounter the question about allowing a terminally ill patient to end his or her life intentionally through some, painless method like medication and intentional overdose, right? As was the case with Brittany Maynard, that we often, that's presented to us as what I think of as actually a false choice, right? In other words, that if a person who is at the end of their life due to a terminal illness that causes suffering, that if they wish to end that suffering by ending their life, then the person who wants to make the moral argument against that is sort of depicted as, or may understand him or herself to be having to choose between prolonging life and preventing suffering, right? However, medically, it is almost always the case that that is a false choice, right? That there are other options. And Brittany Maynard is an interesting situation because she is a kind of, I wouldn't say unique case, but a very rare case in which there are not as many other options, right? What do I mean by that? Well, I'll tell you a little story. Years ago, I had a colleague who since retired from Misericordia, was a professor, who told me about encountering his father, who was dying of bone cancer. Bone cancer is a very painful disease in many forms, in many situations. His father was in a great deal of pain. And he went to the hospital to visit his father. His father lived far away, and when he went to visit him, saw him for the first time, his father was in such extreme suffering that he said, quote, "If I had a gun, I would have shot him right in the head." And that's a sentiment that may sound very strong and even brutal, but I understand it, right? If you see someone suffering that much, that's very disturbing, right? It shouldn't be allowed. But, I didn't say this to him, and I'm glad I didn't, but I could have said, or I thought about saying, if you had a gun, you should have gone and found his doctor and threatened to get medical care for him. And not, obviously not in favor of threatening people or anything like that. But, at the end of the day, a person who is suffering at the end of life from bone cancer should be sedated to a degree that they are not aware of what's going on. And that is almost always medically possible. The cases in which that is not possible are pretty rare. And that's the reason why we talked in previous modules about the idea of a sort of sedation that may, as an unintended secondary effect, accelerate or speed the dying process, right? Which does happen with people at the end of life fairly often. And the Catholic Church is open to that, again, as long as your intentionality is not to end the life, but to reduce suffering. So in almost every case at the end of life, death is not the only way to prevent suffering. Suffering can be prevented in other ways that don't require the patient or the family and the caregivers to make a difficult decision about when to end the person's life. So that's one of the reasons why I think that this debate is often a kind of a false dichotomy, or it's a false choice. The other thing I would suggest is that the debate is also sometimes framed poorly in terms of control. And that was certainly the case with the Brittany Maynard videos. And I understand these folks are making rhetorical videos to try to make a point about legalization of physician-assisted suicide, medical assistance in dying. And that in doing so, they're deploying all the rhetorical resources they can. And one of them is this idea of appealing to control. And we like control. Americans, Westerners, post-Enlightenment individual types, we like the idea of control. In fact, people would argue in some cases that your ability to control your life is what makes you human. That's not an argument that I would make, and I don't think it's a particularly Catholic argument either. But I will say this, that dying is essentially about a sort of lack of control. We're all going to die, and most of us are going to die in a time and place and way that we don't choose. And so the confrontation with death is the confrontation with the ultimate loss of control. And the truth is that to be human is to often be out of control, or to have limits to what you can control. And we've all encountered this. You can't make somebody love you. You can't make the world conform to the things that you want it to be all the time. You can't always have the best circumstances. We can choose our own actions, right? But But I think that one thing that I'd say about being human is that being in control is not always a source of happiness. Rather, being able to learn to live with the limitations that we experience as human beings, to learn to live with the occasional loss of control, and to be able to sort of embrace the human through that. I think that is the source of happiness for human beings. So I don't think control is the most important thing. And I don't think control is the only way to die with dignity. In fact, I think that much of what human beings do that is dignified is come to terms with situations over which they don't have complete control, or in some cases, any control. And that's really what human dignity is all about. So I guess I would say that I think that the real interesting thing about the physician-assisted suicide / medical assistance in dying debate is that it surfaces or it uncovers some real difficult issues about end of life, and also some difficult issues about our system. If people think that taking their own life is the only way to reduce end of life suffering, or the best way to reduce end of life suffering, to me that suggests that those people are not getting terrific care. They're not getting terrific palliative care. I think Brittany Maynard makes a kind of exception because in her case, the glioblastoma, the brain tumor can lead to a kind of existential suffering, personality change, and so forth, that would be very difficult to manage at the end of life. And I think that in as far as there is anybody that has an argument for the availability of medical assistance in dying, it would be somebody in a situation like that, where the illness itself was of a kind that it wouldn't just cause painful suffering, physical suffering that could be managed with medication, but that it might cause this kind of unavoidable existential suffering. People with glioblastoma, I have a friend whose father died of glioblastoma years ago, and he told me how his father woke up and started telling his mother he didn't love her anymore. They'd been married for 25 years, right? You don't certainly want to be in that situation. And, if that's the sort of thing that could not be managed for whatever reason with medication, then to me that makes the best case. But those are pretty rare cases, and you could even begin to see how that sort of situation could be managed through medication and proper care. But anyway, I just wanted to put in my 2 cents there. Appreciated all of your thoughtful responses, and I'm working on the grading. I was at Citi Field for a couple days this week seeing some Mets games, so I'm a little bit behind. I apologize for that, but I'm catching up right now. Hope everybody has a good day. Take care.